Hello, everyone. I'm Tanuja Kopal, Contributing Editor for Lab Manager, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for our Product Spotlight webinar hosted by Lab Manager in partnership with LIS Corporation, which is now a division of Abbott. Today we are joined by Lee Boyd, who is the Manager of National Accounts for Abbott Informatics. Lee joined Abbott in his current position earlier this year, and prior to joining Abbott, he held several positions in sales and sales management at several different companies, DynaCare Labs, Sunquest Information Systems, Atlas Medical, and most recently at 4Medica. He is here today to talk about how technologies, particularly from an informatics standpoint, how these technologies are changing the ways in which labs work today. So as Lee is going over his slides, if any questions come to mind, please type it into the question box, which appears on the left-hand side of your screen, and all you have to do is hit submit. I will be receiving those on my end, and we definitely like to keep things very interactive here, so we will bring up your questions and comments for discussion after Lee is done with his talk. During the webinar, we'll also be asking you a few questions to get more insight into why and what you do to fulfill some of your informatics needs. So please participate in the polling when the question comes up on your screen. It is a very simple format. All you will see is a multiple choice, a question with multiple choice answers, and all you have to do is just click on the circle that's located next to the response you want to select. The polling is all kept very anonymous, but the results are shared with everyone almost instantly. So it's really an opportunity for all of us to learn and discuss what we do and why we do it. Today's webinar will also be archived on Lab Manager's website, and we will be sending you that web link via email in a couple of days. You can use that link to review the webinar, or you can forward it along to colleagues who may have missed this webinar. Today, you will also be Today, please note that you will not be able to download any slides from the archive. For a copy of the slides, you will have to reach out to Lee, and we will share his email address with you in our closing slide. The webinar platform, I also wanted to mention, is very user-friendly. You can move and expand the slide window on your screen if you want to better see the text. You can also download a resource that we have posted in our resource widget provided by LIS, and that's something that you may want to check out. So now, without any further delay, let me welcome Lee, and I'm glad he's taken the time to join us today.
Thank you, Tanisha. I appreciate being invited to do this today. What I'm going to first go through is really discuss why we're here in terms of the attendees. I know that are across many industries, so this presentation is geared toward the healthcare market, and I know that some of the terms may or may not be applicable to a pharmaceutical lab or a forensics or a chemical lab, but just bear with me. I think there's a lot of the text from the slides that really is applicable to multiple different industries. So with that said, I'm going to highlight what is the difference between an LIS and a LIMS, or Laboratory Information System. An LIS is what is really typically used within the healthcare or a clinical lab, an anatomic lab, reference lab, hospital-based lab, etc. And it has really been serving just the medical laboratories. So this term may be different than what is used in chemical or oil and gas or some of the other environmental labs that may be attending this. But what I think the value that they are is certainly they've really excelled in the clinical functionality because they were geared toward one industry, and that was healthcare, serving patients. And it would have all the clinical rules, the methodologies, the healthcare-specific terminology of ICD-9 codes, SNOMED, LOINC, etc. But what I think in today's market we're seeing is there really is not much flexibility in the old traditional LIMS with accommodating modern workflows. And we'll talk much more in detail about that in a minute. And certainly because of the older technology, any modifications to the system or the code or generating specific reports involve vendors. And oftentimes when you involve your vendor, there are added costs. You potentially would have to generate a document, code specification document, have a a signature process to sign off on that code. The code is then developed and put into production, and that process could be months down the road, and that, frankly, is not the most efficient way to run a laboratory these days. In today's world, a modern LIMS system brings several things to the healthcare market that, frankly, are because of where they have been in other industries. And when I say other industries, I didn't even include things such as oil and gas, or there's certainly others, but forensics, pharma, manufacturing, environmental. Why are these even important? It's really because these are industries that are very, very highly regulated in most cases. The compliance is just as strict, if not stricter, than portions of healthcare. And these industries are all around the world. And so the potentially U.S. government regulations for healthcare or forensics may be different than what they are in Europe. And so by having the technology of a LIMS that is used across multiple industries provides significant value because they're more flexible. They've had to be more flexible over the years to accommodate different types of compliances, from audit checking to chain of custody to different compliance regulations that are brought about. Now, on a downside, LIMS have typically not been very functional within a healthcare specific or a clinical market. But over the last 5 to 8 years, that has changed dramatically. And so they bring a significant amount of value to the healthcare market that was not there from a functional standpoint. Why do the LIMS/LISs need to be flexible within healthcare? It's pretty straightforward in my opinion. Certainly from the U.S. standpoint, there's been a lot of changes within the healthcare, but from the actual medicine side of things, with the cracking of the genome, I think back in 2003, there's been a tremendous influx of new laboratories cropping up almost weekly around the U.S. and around the world that are using patented algorithms and methodologies that are oftentimes backed by a world-famous scientist and some venture capital. And frankly, those modern methodologies are not able to be handled by a typical LIS that has been around for 10, 15 years, which is what is in most of the laboratories in the United States today. These methods are increasing. They are the fastest area of growth within the laboratory market, what I would call the esoteric testing market. And to be competitive as well as growing your laboratory, you need to have a modern platform that allows you to create the workflows and the screens to accommodate these modern tests that are being developed out there today. From the public health side, obviously there has been quite a bit more on the public health reporting in the laboratory market, or the healthcare laboratory market in the U.S. Just as recent as in the last month, we have seen the Ebola breakout in parts of the world. We've had some tuberculosis scares around the U.S. and ricin and things of this nature, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years. And so, as we have all seen, hospitals have had to automate the reporting process to their state laboratories and in some cases the CDC. And this has not always been the case, certainly, but again, the state may have a different type of technology in one state versus the next, so the flexibility goes to, you need to be able to accommodate and have a more modern architecture that allows for different reporting formats and capabilities, and certainly methods of transmitting data, which we will talk about here in a minute. Competitive pressures, I think everyone can validate that healthcare costs seem to be rising, reduced reimbursements in certain areas, certainly within the anatomic pathology labs over the last few years. The need for implementing Lean Six Sigma to create a more modern and a more efficient laboratories. There aren't as many people in the med tech schools these days. Some of them have even shut down, and so you're doing more work with less people. And then lastly, the LIMS and LIS in the healthcare market, we live in a day of instant need for data access across any device, anytime, and that's frankly the expectation of what has come about in the last decade or less. And the technology does exist to be able to handle those needs, which just frankly were not around several years ago. We'll talk a little bit here about the next 2 or 3 slides are going to be about the flexibility, and then we'll talk more about the modern side of it. Why do you need the flexibility of the architecture? One of the main things is the management or workflow management tools. If you had asked a typical LIS if they can create workflows for genetic sequencing or PCR or DNA extraction or any of those sort of workflows, typically those can't be accommodated. And if you can't accommodate them, you're not going to be able to grow your lab, because that is where the growth is in the laboratory market in healthcare. Within interoperability, I think that the typical healthcare LIS has done a good job, a very good job with the tools and the older technology they have had. They've frankly had to deal with lots of, I would say, older languages out there, but HL7 is done, and using HL7, that's been very, very prevalent or the most commonly used language to submit data back and forth. But what I think a modern LIMS brings to the table is HTML5 allows for an additional way to get data back and forth. It opens up additional APIs or application programming interfaces for complex web applications that, again, may or may not be needed, but it just allows a little bit more flexibility there. And then lastly, this is new, in my opinion, to the clinical lab world of the term called SDMS for Scientific Data Management Systems. Typically, a healthcare laboratory sends and receives data, or let me back that up. They send or receive electronic exchange based on live feeds from instruments. What an SDMS or Scientific Data Management System brings to the table is there is oftentimes non-structured sorts of data. Those can be graphs or PDF documents or JPEGs that often reside on someone's hard drive and they never make it into the LIMS or LIS because there's no way to get that data in. And there is this technology that's used very widely outside of healthcare that allows for parsing of non-structured data with recognition technology based on keywords or graphs or whatnot that can extract data. It's set up once and allows for any file type to be imported into your LIMS, not as a static piece of information, but a searchable, queried information that can obviously be shared. And so there's no more silos of data, and that is a very, very powerful tool. The flexibility really goes to the underlying architecture. That there are LIMS out there today that are 100% web-based, not just web-enabled. And when I say web-based, you may have a single lab set of servers that can handle 200 locations around a country, and they can be accessed from anywhere, anytime, on any browser. This, again, was not the case in the past. You have to be flexible with your backend database in terms of what you can run on. And certainly the Microsoft.NET framework really allows for programmers to combine their own source code within that framework. So you may have different types of source code from different organizations that can be brought together all as one framework. Again, it really allows for a more robust application. And then certainly, and what I think is almost most importantly, is HTML5. It allows for the introduction of APIs for the more, from HTML5 or HTML4 to 5 allows for the more complex web applications to be interfaced to. It allows for, it's built to be run on low-powered devices such as smartphones. So it allows for anything to be run from within a smartphone or a tablet, etc. And again, this was not the case in the past. The three-tiered architecture, I don't think we need to go into a lot of detail, but the bottom line is the problem that healthcare has had in the past has been there may be some customizations or configurations on an old LIMS that anytime the technology layer is updated or the custom code goes from one version to the next of that software, it doesn't work correctly. And they really haven't divided out the layers within the application so that today, modern LIMS, what they have done is essentially kept the customer data separate, and it really allows for you to protect your investment. Every lab, whether it's healthcare, forensics, or pharmaceutical, clinical trials, you have your different workflows that are specific and oftentimes patented workflows. When you go to update to the next version of software, you should not have to rebuild all that work and that knowledge into the, let's say, a new technology layer. And why is this important? It allows you to go to the next version within a few days instead of, in many cases, many, many months. And then obviously, in doing that, it lowers your cost basis for having that application. So now I'm going to pause for just a minute and turn it over to Tanusha to give us a questionnaire briefly.
All right. Thank you, Lee. So here comes our first polling question. Again, as I mentioned, all you have to do is click against the response and then hit submit, and we will tabulate the results within a few seconds. So the question is, how long does it take for you to upgrade your LIS? Has it taken you less than 30 days, between 31 and 60 days, 60 to 90 days, or has it really taken you more than 90 days? So we are very anxious to find out what your experience has been. So we'll close the poll in a few seconds, and we'll tabulate the results right away. So click on the response and hit submit. Let's see what the results look like. All right. There it is on your screen. And Lee, any surprises? It looks like most people think it will take more than 90 days for it to be upgraded.
No, this is exactly what I anticipated based on the technology that is out there, and most laboratories around the country and the world today are, frankly, that there's typically not a three-layer architecture that allows to do updates very quickly instead of over, many times 6 months. So I'm not surprised. Okay. So I'm going to go on.
Thanks. Absolutely. Thanks again, everyone. And our second polling question will come up shortly. So please continue, Lee.
So again, what I want to bring out today in terms of cloud technologies, this has certainly been around for a number of years now. But if you were to Google the number of Fortune 500 companies around the world that use cloud services for at least one core application, you would be astonished that it is a very, very large number. There are companies around the world that specialize in hosting applications. They have their physical security, their technical security. They can give you 99.99% uptime in some cases. Certainly within the healthcare world, we have to comply with HIPAA and all the regulations around that. So that has been accommodated in most, if not all, the LIMS that are out there today. But what I think the cloud brings, the value it brings to a healthcare organization, if you are a small organization, frankly, you may not have the staff to maintain, the infrastructure from database backups, updates to your software, updates to your hardware, things of that nature. And then if you are a very large organization, you may want to leverage the buying power of some of these, what I'll call data centers around the world, whether it's Savvis or Terramark. There's dozens of them that are very large in this space, but you can leverage essentially the space of not having massive server farms within your own operations and not having to update or upgrade to new hardware every 3 to 5 years, which is what typically the IBMs and Dells of the world recommend. So it's becoming much more common, and it's certainly something that you would want to investigate. Unified technology. I think in my mind, this is probably the single most important slide I will show today. And why is that? If you look at the top left, you see your LIS and your LIMS, and you look at your document management or your parsing tool and your interface engine and business analytics. Typically, of all these different, I would say, functions, there is usually 3 or 4 vendors represented. Now, within the document management space, there's Documentum. Within the interface engine space, there's CorePoint or eGate. Business intelligence, there's several vendors. And what this has been the common practice in the past 10 to 15 years of a healthcare-specific laboratory may have 3 or 4 vendors that they're having to work with. And why is that an issue? Well, you really don't have all your data in one place. Frankly, there are areas of the interface that may not map across, and so you're oftentimes missing some core data. Secondly, the cost of doing all that interfacing is dramatically higher than having one vendor. And so whether it's one LIMS vendor or another vendor, having all this technology that's built and unified, not interfaced together, but an actual built from the ground up, all these applications together give you a tremendous amount of power to have all this data within one repository. Whether it's and I could have added more things such as billing or inventory management. Again, a lot of these things would fall under the core LIMS, but there's still things that have typically been a separate vendor, and these in a modern laboratory can all be the same vendor, and there's tremendous power in not having to interface and deal with the headache of potentially losing data. Now, when we talked about the technology side, now from a functional side, the LIMS, the LISs in the healthcare world have very robust applications within the core lab and molecular and micro and anatomic pathology, et cetera. What I think LIMS has now caught up, and they bring these core strengths to the table from a clinical and functional perspective. and you see I have inventory management on the bottom. Well, obviously inventory management is used very heavily within the manufacturing world for LIMS and other areas. There's billing, there's other aspects. So this is something that is very important, that all this is now used together. And then on the right-hand side, a typical LIMS has not just the core LIS, but there's often these labs today that store samples for not the typical 7 to 14 days, but for months, if not years, these genetics laboratories. So that functionality exists already in your core LIMS. You have all the tracking and importing of samples, shipping samples that may be for research, all the clinical trials workflows. So all this sort of modern needs of trials, storing and shipping of samples, all comes with your LIMS, in addition to the inventories, the billings, some of these other aspects that would have been separate vendors in the past.
All right, here's our second poll coming up. So can you tell us if you're able to create your own rules with a tool set where manual processes could be automated? So, click on yes if you can do it yourself, yes if you can do it with vendor coding and costs, and no if it's not possible to do that. Okay, we'll tabulate your results in a few seconds. Appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. Okay, and here are the results. It's almost. I think, Lee, what do you think of the results? Looks like a third, can do it themselves. Another third can, do it with vendor coding.
Yeah,
40% cannot do it. Yeah, cannot do it at all.
So a modern LIMS today allows you, and I'll move on to the next slide. A modern LIMS today allows the the user to do this themselves. And what I'll bring up here is, because the LIMS comes from other industries outside of healthcare, they have had to be flexible. They have had to accommodate lots of different rules for compliance, for workflows across all these industries. And as a result, most LIMS have a very, very robust rules engine that allows the end user to, and again, I won't get into the details, but to essentially develop their own rules. And these rules could be something such as, in a clinical lab, if the quantity is not sufficient at the time of accessioning, I want to fire off an email to the client that the test is canceled, or I want to automatically fire off an email to customer services with the reason why it's canceled. Again, you can automate these so that there is none of this going in, having to manually create the email or manually send something over to customer services. Or let's say there's a value is greater than whatever, 400. It may require a supervisor review before that test is released. Again, these are clinical rules that can be generated by the users at any time without a vendor involvement or any vendor cost. And it's very, very powerful so that you can, generate rules for not only modern workflows such as the sequencing, but also within your day-to-day workflow of the, accessioning or reporting or the customer service department. Being able, this just wasn't around when I was in the LIS world. There were no rule manager tool sets that allowed you to do this yourself. We talked a little bit about this, but again, from the background of clinical labs in the U.S. over the last 10 to 20 years, exchange of data has typically been live data feeds from instruments based on protocols, bidirectional, et cetera, but there really was not the capability to bring in the non-standard, non-structured sort of data formats, whether it's CSV files or text or PDFs or JPEGs or Excel. And this technology is very common outside of healthcare in that not only bringing or grabbing the document or the file in this case, the ability to parse that data, search on keywords that are set up one time so that each time a file is generated from maybe an instrument or a standard operating procedure or whatnot, that data is automatically brought in and it can be searched across your organizations, and there's no individual within your immunology department that stores all your slide images or your positive test results that have a PDF attached to them and they're not in your core LIMS. All this data now can be brought into your system, and that frankly has not been the case within healthcare. Interfacing tools, we talked a little bit about this. Typically an LIS has done a very good job with the technology they've had. It's done oftentimes with HL7. The more modern systems use web services. A LIMS today, some of the value they bring is, the HTML5 allows for APIs for the more complex web applications, and then you will have what I'll call a dashboard or an instrument manager that allows for seeing the status of your interfaces. And certainly some of the LIS platforms that are out there today, even some of the old ones have done this. But you certainly need to have the flexibility, and I think HTML5 allows that for the interfacing, and certainly having your own proprietary interface engine as part of your LIMS really adds a lot of value so that you're not having to go to a third-party vendor. Go ahead, Tanisha.
Thank you, Lee. So here's our final poll question. The question is, are you able to create workflows for modern testing, such as plate-based testing or next-gen sequencing? Yes. Yes again, but with vendor costs. And if you're not able to do it, please click on no and hit submit. Okay. Lee, any surprises with that? Because it looks like majority of our viewers cannot create workflows for modern applications.
Again, this is just as I expected. It is oftentimes because the technology behind the scenes does not allow for creating of your own screens, creating of your own workflows that allow you to be competitive in the marketplace. So just a few more slides in terms of some of the technology. Obviously, the rise of the smartphone and the tablets has been around for a long time. Most of the LIS applications have adopted this and are pretty good about exposing the functionality of their system. But what a modern LIMS or a modern application brings to the table is, because of the underlying architecture and the language built in, any screen, and when I say any screen, any sort of screen can be exposed on any device. So you may use your smartphone to do your barcode scanning if you're in a hospital, instead of having a dedicated barcode or what I'll call positive patient ID device that are typically they're Motorola or Symbols or something like that. Today, you can use your own native apps to do that you can create, because any screen, so a lab supervisor could be at lunch and could approve certain results from what being outside the laboratory, and their screen would be different than maybe someone in accessioning or someone in reporting, because again, any of these can be exposed, and obviously with HTML5 it allows for a browser agnostic platform. So if it's Firefox or Safari or Internet Explorer, Chrome, etc., these are what are available on the market today. ELN, I won't talk too much about it, but again, this is something I think from where I come in the healthcare world that is really, it's been used in a lot of other industries that are not really a clinical lab. It's used a lot in the pharmaceutical and the clinical trials world, where standard operating procedures or SOPs are enforced manually today. When you can do this on an Excel-like format that confirms if certain steps are taken, so that when you are going through the process or a workflow of generating a batch or generating a run potentially within a clinical laboratory, or in the pharmaceutical world you're doing your trials, and these are things that the ability to reduce those transcription errors is significant. I'm going to show an example here. On the left-hand side, it would be a standard operating procedure or a workflow manual that is typically paper-based. They may be 40, 50, 60 pages long to go through all the processes of, let's say, running a esoteric type of test. You can essentially recreate that in an Excel-like format with tabs down at the bottom that will go from, confirm, process, test, etc., so that every step is accommodated and can be forced that if it's not done or not done properly, it's not going to allow you to go to the next step. So it really reduces the transcription errors. And again, these are just things that have come about on the healthcare side, or really the clinical side, that were typically done for other industries, clinical trials. Business intelligence tools. This is something that a modern LIMS today has what I'll just say this is a very nice graphical display, very visual, that are interactive. So any database field, and let me repeat that, there are business intelligence tools that can display any database field on the screen and have it be interactive. That screen is your specific screen as a user. So if I'm in the QC department, I may want to have a screen that just shows the status of my instrumentation. Or if I am in the customer service department, my business intelligence tool just wants to show the turnaround time of samples, or potentially samples that are missing information. So the look and feel of what is displayed is really your KPIs, or your key performance indicators for various individuals. Obviously, as a manager, you may want to show the total volume of the laboratory, etc. But these are real-time, they're actionable, they can be created by the individual or maybe by the lab IT manager. Doesn't involve any business vendor involvement. Again, creating a smarter lab. That's what we're all about, is using these modern tools to give you more efficiency in being proactive with problems. And again, this will lead to a proactive customer service department. How nice would it be to call a client the next day and say, this specimen was canceled because there was not enough quantity, or maybe have an email generated 2 hours after it was received within the laboratory telling them that it was canceled, and no one even had to make a phone call. Lots of different applications or ways that you can become more efficient with some of these tools that are allowed by the modern technologies out there. again, this is just another example of advanced analytics, based on maybe by workflow of department or by individuals or amount of samples coming across, for an individual site. All this data can be configured by the end user to be specific to their needs, and it's across every field in the database. Specialty lab workflows, we've really talked quite a bit about this. Again, modern LIMS in summary, modern laboratories. This testing is the fastest growing segment within the laboratories in the U.S. within healthcare, and you've got to have the technology that allows for creating these workflows to handle these modern processes. Analyzer QC, again, something that every LIS has, but being able to very visually see the status of each individual instrument, plotting your Levy-Jennings, your moving averages, etc. All this is available in a modern LIMS. It can be exported to, for maybe your, CLIA or CAP inspections, things of that nature. Again, this is something that's typically been more of an issue in the past. Billing, I won't get into much more detail other than there are modern systems today that have their own billing as part of it. There's no need in many cases to go to outside vendors depending on the type of billing that you are doing. Case study, I'll just show one case study. This is actually a client of StarLims/Abbott. It was a laboratory in the Florida area, toxicology laboratory that essentially had a client that was coming on board with some specific needs that they need to take care of, and they needed to be up and running with an actual implementation of a LIMS in 30 days. And we were able to accomplish this. The cloud certainly helped. There was only, I think it was 4 or 5 instruments. With the clinical dictionary, they were able to bring up the portal ordering for the client to order electronically. But again, in my world 10, 15 years ago, it would be incomprehensible to even discuss. You would be laughed out of the room if you thought you could bring up an LIS in 30 days. Just was not possible with the technology that was there in that time frame. So that is it for my presentation. I think I'm right on time. We're a quarter until the top of the hour. I think that Tanisha is going to see if there are any questions, and I will hang on the line. And Tanisha, if you want to take it from here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lee. I think it was a really nice overview of what's going on today and what we can expect, going forward. So as Lee mentioned, he's here online to help address any questions that you have, or if you want to share any experiences that you have faced in your lab, definitely type it into the question box that you see on the left-hand side of your screen, and we will bring it up for discussion. So meanwhile, Lee, here are a couple of questions. Can you address that? The first question is, how many manual processes can actually be automated with a tool set for creating workflow triggers and rules?
Yep. From my standpoint, I think it's not as much how many, but it's really in the areas. Typically, the most manual areas are the front-end accessioning of samples that come in, whether it is in a clinical trials lab or long-term storage or just a typical hospital or reference lab. Most of those processes are manual, and in doing so manual, there's lots of errors that come into play, and certainly the time and staff that it takes to do that. If you can automate the submission of samples and gather all that data, that's a key benefit.
Got it. And here's a question that I'm sure you have been asked several times. How do you manage data security, particularly when you're talking about smartphones or you're talking about applications in the cloud? That is a big big issue that people are grappling with. So what is your answer to that?
Yes, when you're actually, in our specific application, it's built on HTML5. So when you are accessing it from a smartphone, you are actually logging into the core application as if you are a user. So you have your multi-step authentication process just as if you were logging in from your own computer. So the security is there because again, we're just on the high level. We're using HTML5 just to allow you access, but it's you go through the same authentication processes as if you were right in front of your own computer.
Got it. But then what about the data security at your end? If you're storing things in the cloud, are users guaranteed a certain level of security?
Yes, that in most service are what I will call SLA, service level agreements. All that is not only guaranteed, but there are certain penalties if that is, they are not kept. But today, what you see in the media is oftentimes like with the Apple and someone exposing photos they access through their phone.
Right.
But there have been some very, very egregious hacks across the world, and it's a tough game keeping ahead of that. Certainly, our government has the same issue from a national security standpoint, but healthcare companies and LIMS, they do comply with the HIPAA standards. You certainly need to do your homework in terms of who is hosting your data, and not only from the physical security, but from the the intrusion detection methods that they employ to keep people out.
Yeah, I guess that's the best that you can do. You really have to do your due diligence and make sure that the vendor is using the state-of-art technology. The next question is, what is a typical implementation time for a LIMS solution where one doesn't exist currently? I know we talked about timelines for upgrading, but what if you don't have anything and you're just planning to launch a new LIMS system?
That's a great question, Tanisha, and it's a loaded question because I don't have the details behind that specific lab or
right.
what the types of testing. But I would say it depends on the size of the lab, the amount of instrumentation, the number of actual workflows they have. But a typical implementation, I'll give an example. Obviously, we did one in a month. That is not typical and certainly not recommended. And we've had them take 2 years because of the size and scope of multiple locations. But, if I were to throw out a number, I would say, somewhere from 4 to 7 months.
Right. So we are definitely talking in terms of months and not weeks or days.
Correct. It's not days. I mean, it's people have to really bend over backwards to get someone live in a month.
Right. And also, I think people have to understand that there are a lot of things that even have to happen before the implementation starts. So I think people should be a little bit cognizant of that as well. All right. Any other piece of advice for people, either when they are looking to implement a system or when they are trying to just maintain an existing system? What are some of the common mistakes that people tend to make?
Well, I guess from a recommendation standpoint, not really the mistakes, but from a recommendation standpoint, if you are looking to purchase a new system, typically it's a 7 to 10 year investment of your time. And when I say time, it's a hospital or a reference lab or any sort of lab, they don't replace their core engine, their core LIMS or LIS every 2 or 3 years. It's not something that you replace very often because, frankly, it can be a painful process installing it. So you need to make sure that whatever vendor you decide is built on modern technology and continuing to invest in R&D. You don't want to spend the money and spend the pain to install an application that is frankly going to be obsolete in 2 or 3 years. The technologies are changing, the testing of healthcare is changing, and you need to really keep up so that you leverage that investment and get 10 years out of that significant investment in most cases. And if you go with a vendor that may be a little bit less cost, or they're really great in one aspect, but et cetera, you really need to look at it as a long-term investment with a company that's continuing to spend in the R&D area.
Okay, good to know. And how compatible are these different platforms or systems? So is it easy to switch from one system to the other without losing your your history and any other sort of business intelligence that you have developed using that data and those systems?
Well, it depends on what system they're coming from and what system they go to. If they're on a, let's say LIMS version 1 of a vendor and they go to version 2, typically they get to keep most of that. But if a laboratory is switching from one actual vendor to another vendor, the issue becomes what data can be migrated and how is that data migrated. There are tools that help with this process, but that's typically looked at on a case-by-case basis in terms of what fields and what information needs to come into the new application. I have seen sometimes where it is a painful process and may not be worth the time and investment, and so they may essentially export all their existing data into a separate database with viewing rights or a link within their current, the new LIMS that they use, so that they get access to the data, but it's not actually mapped inside. That's one avenue, but certainly the best avenue is to export that data, clean that data, and then bring in the specific fields and map them into the area of the new LIMS.
I see. So I guess it can be done, but not.
It can be done. It's typically a case-by-case basis if it does make sense to do that. It's not always the size of the data because, frankly, memory is very inexpensive, but it's all the mappings in the database fields that are required to have everything match up accordingly, and that can be cumbersome in some cases.
I see. Okay, here's another question regarding timelines. So the question is, you state that typically it's between 4 to 7 months, but what if it is a manual process and from scratch for an entire lab business? So if, for instance, if it's a startup and if they want to go about installing a new LIMS system, how long do you think that would take?
Sure. Again, it all depends on the type of lab, the type of testing, the number of instrumentation. I can tell you from experience that a small laboratory with maybe 5 or 6 instruments that's getting started from scratch, that can be done in 4 or 5 months. Absolutely. The lab itself needs to have their what I'll call their ducks in a row with their all their test codes, their compendiums, their containers, their specimen requirements. All that sort of information needs to be there and available and in a format that can be imported into a LIMS. But again, a lot of it is really validating the data that already exists and then just creating those workflows, certainly testing it. There's obviously setting up your sites, your departments, your roles, and things of that nature. But back to the core question, yes, it is absolutely feasible and doable to set up a lab in 4 or 7 months from scratch. Absolutely.
Okay.
Just, again, it depends on the size of the lab, but if it's a lab with 5 or 6 instruments, that is something that a modern LIMS has the capability of doing.
Okay. Well, there are some questions relating to cost as well, but I think it would be best if we forward those questions along to Lee, and then he can, talk to you, because it's very hard to give an answer regarding costs unless you understand
Correct.
what the situation is. So I think we would prefer to do that. We'll send you the questions, Lee, and if you can get back to the people who asked those questions, that would be great. The other question actually comes from an individual who is not related to the medical industry, but they are a material analytical power testing laboratory with 28 global sites. The organization, however, does not permit applications that operate in the cloud. So the question is there a system that can still be implemented without doing anything in the cloud?
Well, I guess my answer is it depends. And what I mean by that is they can have it on their own cloud. And when I say their own cloud, they could have the application hosted in their environment, in their private network that's only available to their end users, so that it doesn't have to be hosted in the cloud by a third party, maybe, these companies, the Amazons, the Savas,
right.
There's dozens of companies that do that, but the answer is they can have it in a private cloud, which is their own cloud, and certainly if they feel that their own internal network is secure, then the actual application would be secure because it's within their own environment. And yes, we have clients that that are doing that, and again, if they're accessing their network across the world, then they're having to go, it could be through VPN or whatnot, but my answer to that is they can host it within their own environment.
I see. But so it can be done by them without doing it in a cloud. They could still do it using their own servers and what have you. So
yes,
it can be done.
Yes.
It doesn't have to necessarily be done in a cloud, whether private or otherwise. It can be done without using a cloud at all.
Correct.
Okay. And the next question is, does modern LIMS require a middleware?
No, it does not. And again, to caveat that answer, it depends on what type of laboratory. When I consider middleware, there's typically middleware between the LIMS and the instrument, or there's middleware between the LIMS and the client getting a result. And the answer is no, there does not have to be a middleware at all. And it's typically, what I'll call the data managers. In case of some vendors, Data Innovations is one of the leaders out there. Great company. There is the technology today that in a modern LIMS that have I'll just call them the proprietary interfacing tools that you can go directly to the instrument and you don't need the middleware. But again, it's a loaded question because I didn't get the background of what they mean by middleware.
Right.
And certainly it's the same. Go ahead.
No, I was saying that some of these questions you're right. I mean, you need to know more in order to give a better answer, and we are going to do that. We are going to send you all the questions, and if you feel like some questions you require more information from them, please take the time to reach out to them, and you can start a dialogue, which will hopefully, work well for both of you.
Okay. Great.
And I'm going to ask a last question, and with that, I think we come to the end of this webinar. So the last question is, will these systems actually support barcode systems that can track the analyst, the equipment, and the methodology? I remember you saying that can be done, right?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Will these LIMS systems support barcode systems that can track analyst, equipment, and methodology?
Yes. So typically a LIMS supports barcodes. In the case of ours, there is not a limit on the type of barcode symbology or 1D or 2D. There is no limit there. But the second half of that question comes to the equipment and methodologies. Yes, those are absolutely tracked. It's not always via barcode, but yes, that is tracked in terms of what test and what analyte and what sample was performed on what instrument. It is, you can, even have your QC for that instrument automatically brought up, but you can even have your tracking of instruments down to how many samples they did, what samples. It's a very, very sophisticated hierarchy of tracking. Actual tests can be assigned to certain instruments and vice versa, so that only certain instruments only do certain maybe studies that would go to a certain instrument. So it's, again, the hierarchy is very, very sophisticated compared to the general laboratory LIS that have been on the market over the last 10 to 25 years.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, we have reached the end of our webinar time, but I hope we have answered most of your questions. Just a reminder to note down Lee's contact information. His email appears on your screen. If you need a copy of his slides, or if you need to reach out to him for additional guidance on this topic, you have his email address. On behalf of Lab Manager, I would like to thank our sponsor, STAR LIMS Corporation, for their participation and support of this event. Thank you so much, Lee, for putting together a really nice, informative talk on lab informatics and some of the trends and happenings, and also for taking the time to address all the questions that came in today. And a big thank you to all of you out there. You have been a really active audience, for the questions, for participating in all the polls. So thank you. Thanks a lot. It's made for a very interactive and interesting webinar. As I mentioned to you earlier, the webinar will be archived on Lab Manager's website, and we typically leave it on there for at least 6 months. So do visit us online to review this webinar. There are also links to past webinars, and we are constantly updating the site with information on new webinar topics. So until next time, everyone, goodbye and good luck.